Timothy Alberino is here, and Timothy is an author. He's a researcher and explorer whose 2020 release, Birthright, is a favorite of many of you at home. He became a bestseller as well. He's traveled around the world investigating theories and alternative history, the mystery of the megalithic builders, the mythologies of ancient giants, and various aspects of the UFO phenomenon. And he returns tonight to catch up and actually talk a little bit about that phenomenon, which is, again, I guess front and center, but I don't know who's seen it after the last week. Timothy, how you feeling?
Hey, Frank, it's great to be with you as always.
Oh, yeah. It's what a week. How are you assessing things the last 7 or 8 days? It's we're all living through it, and then we'll get to the hearing on Capitol Hill.
Well, I'm very happy to see that Trump is making mostly solid appointments to his administration. They just announced today that RFK Jr. is going to head the HHS, which is monumental, really. I mean, we really have a shot at reforming some of these agencies, and of course, Musk and Ramaswamy over at the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, which Trump also announced will be created. So, like I said, I mean, we've got a real shot at reform. But I got a feeling that the deep state isn't done yet. They've got something up their sleeve. Yeah. They're not going to lay down. They're not going to just lay down and go quietly.
You know, I think that's a great way to start into what we're talking about. We're going to be mainly talking about tonight, and that's all disclosure, because we were asking the same question here on Tuesday night, then it came up again last night. It also came up in another show I was doing, and that was, now that what is really historically unprecedented comeback has happened, and there is once again a chance at a chance, the real question is, when you see what has galvanized people from all different stripe around the country to bring them together for what we witnessed last Tuesday, what keeps those people together after the very short 4 years that are coming our way? And the one thing that keeps coming up with all of my very astute friends is, Frank, it's disclosure. And it is disclosure across all areas: high technology, hidden cures, JFK, assassination programs, Gladio, and of course, what's going on in the skies, and UFO disclosure, which we got to talk about tonight. But what do you think about that from that standpoint? How important do you think disclosure is going forward for the next few years?
Well, I think that the Trump presidency will be marked by disclosure of many things, as you're alluding to there. Maybe perhaps even disclosure of a stolen election in 2020, disclosure of criminal activity during the pandemic. I think we're going to see a lot of interesting revelations, interesting information come to light, and perhaps even in the realm of UFO disclosure. Trump himself, I don't believe, is very interested in the, let's call it, the alien presence or UFO disclosure. But hopefully people around him are. And he can certainly help the congressmen who are in this fight. And I think he can make a big difference if, as I said, if people in his administration are interested in this topic and Trump gives them authority to do anything about it.
You said something there about the alien presence, and I guess that's really where we separate the wheat from the chaff here, because what's going on in D.C., which, it's there for everybody to see, but it actually is in the background because of how big all the appointments, the news of every appointment is coming out. But it was out there. I watched a little bit of it. I saw Michael Schellenberger there and Luis Elizondo. Everybody has, opinions on these particular speakers there. But there were some really interesting things that were said. And a lot of other stuff in between, a lot of babble that we've heard before that didn't really interest me. But there were some gems in there. I'd like to talk about those takeaways with you. But no matter what, when you talk about the technology that is being examined and put on the table, the way that's being described, the way that the craft are moving, whether it's us or from somewhere else, it's a world-changing proposition no matter what. If it's just something we created and kept secret, the kind of technology we're talking about is world-changing.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that all of the whistleblowers who have come forward so far and all of the witnesses they all have the same opinion about this phenomenon. And we're talking about now guys from the intelligence community, pilots, Elizondo, who was working at, now we know for sure, working at ATIP, even the NASA guy, who was largely a waste of time sitting there on that panel. All of them have the same perception of this phenomenon. It is non-human. Now, that doesn't rule out the possibility that we have our own craft that are advanced aerospace vehicles now that are essentially hybrids of exotic technology with conventional components. Yes, that's true as well. But the core reality of this phenomenon is non-human. There is a non-human intelligence operating this craft. And that is the consensus. And I think that there's a lot of speculation out there, on what used to be known as UFO Twitter, UFO X, about all of this just being a cover for the government's own advanced technology or aerospace projects. Well, some of it may be a cover, but I think that in this hearing particularly, that narrative is blown. That narrative was blown up in this hearing. And specifically, this hearing wasn't as explosive as the last one. The allegations made by David Grush were certainly, I think, more alarming and incredible. But nevertheless, there were some revelations that I think are extraordinary. For example, Admiral Gallaudet confirmed essentially that the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, is a DoD counteroffensive operation created to discredit and discourage further congressional inquiry into the matter of UFOs, especially as it pertains to crash retrievals and alien bodies. Let me give you a quote here from something he said during the hearing. He said, "Earlier this year, I met with the DoD's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, and what I thought would be a 90-minute meeting just to meet with leadership turned out to be an hours-long influence operation on me." Let me say that again. He said, what I thought would be a 90-minute meeting just to meet with leadership turned out to be an hours-long influence operation on me. They attempted to convince me of the validity of the very flawed and error-ridden historical records report. In addition, they tried to have me question very valid UAP reports like the Tic Tac incident, even stating possibly that the Tic Tac was American technology. And they also cast discredit on various UAP whistleblowers and witnesses to question their validity and credibility, end quote. So what the Admiral is saying here is that he was called into a meeting with the Aero personnel, with what he thought would just be a meeting with leadership, and he found himself in a position where they were attempting to coerce him into making declarations that he didn't believe were true. And those declarations were in favor of the idea that all of this UAP stuff is just high-tech American technology. There's your narrative, okay? Mm-hmm. There's your government narrative right there. That's the narrative that's being pushed. The government is not pushing the crash retrieval and alien bodies narrative. Quite the opposite. The government is pushing, and when I say the government, the DoD specifically in this case, the Pentagon, they are pushing the narrative that UAP are conventional or unconventional technology developed by us, essentially, developed by the United States Air Force or aerospace contractors. And clearly that's the narrative that's being pushed here.
I think that's why a lot of people might are skeptical. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why people are skeptical. I think people that were used to be a lot more interested in this just want to see a damn alien all of a sudden. They just want to see something. Just show us something that's not paper mache from Mexico in a little box or whatever the hell it is. But when it comes to, for example, the testimony about military interception stories that continue, just like the fleets of what they thought was drones, largely over Langley and other places. When you say that those things are hovering over military bases, or like they said in this last hearing yesterday, that there is recon being run over nuclear facilities and research and development sites. I mean, that's something where if any of us flew anything over those sites, we'd be at least met with military force. I don't understand how these stories can just be put out to the public and it doesn't conclude with the military responding with lethal force. That's just weird.
Well, that was one of the points that was brought up yesterday during the hearing is, the Pentagon can't have it both ways. They can't be denying a national security threat or that UAP constitute a non-human, perhaps even adversarial presence, and at the same time say there's nothing to see here, this is just all conventional or perhaps unconventional secret Air Force technology or something like that. And I think some of that hypocrisy was revealed yesterday. There's obviously, and I've said this before, and there's obviously a factional conflict going on right now inside of the government. You have what Richard Dolan calls the secrecy group, and then you have the disclosure group. And the secrecy and the disclosure group are at odds right now. And the disclosure group is pushing for more hearings and more witnesses and more testimony. And the secrecy group is fighting tooth and nail. And I know that that's true. There is an element of the United States, what I like to call the dumb state. Others call it the deep state. Actually, the dumb state is a bit different. That's, a reference to deep underground military bases where a lot of these projects are actually being developed. There's a lot of obfuscation happening right now. In fact, the Pentagon's own research organization, AARO, was denied access to the documentation regarding the Nimitz incident, the Tic Tac UFO. Mm-hmm. So let's think about this for a moment. So here they bring in Admiral Gallaudet, who was one of the witnesses yesterday. The AARO does in a debrief with him to ostensibly to debrief him about his experiences with UAP. And here they don't even have access. They admitted to Congress that they couldn't even get access to the Tic Tac material, the data, the information related to the Tic Tac from the Pentagon. Couldn't even get access. But here they are trying to convince the Admiral that it's not non-human, it's U.S. secret technology that's developed for the Air Force or whatever it was that they were trying to convince him. Obviously, you have a preconditioned narrative from the Pentagon that they are going to try and push all the way through this process, this attempted disclosure, let's call it, the effort for disclosure. They're going to continue to push the narrative that UAP have conventional explanations. But at the same time, people on the other side are trying to bring out witnesses and individuals from private sector and government to testify about the phenomenon, and all of the witnesses are saying the same thing. This is a non-human phenomenon. So to all the people who think that the whole thing is just a disinformation operation, well, you have to explain that the incoherency of the message. You have to explain the conflict that's apparent, the public conflict between the secrecy group and the disclosure group. And I've been interfacing with some of the congressmen on the UAP committee, and these are good dudes. These guys are very, very upset about the proposition that elements of the United States government, in collaboration with aerospace defense contractors are intentionally circumventing Congress and effectively the American public, and are hiding all of this information from us using taxpayer money, and also I would say probably dark money sources, but certainly taxpayer money. These guys are very incensed about this, legitimately. This is not a show trial. This is not a disinfo operation. As I said, the guys who are at the core of this thing in Congress are extremely sincere. They want to know if the government has in fact recovered alien craft and alien bodies and is reverse engineering that technology, or has been for a long time. So there's a sincere effort, and that effort should not be ignored or just just dismissed as a disinfo campaign.
Here's the thing, though. Even if it is just conventional American there's nothing conventional about it. Just learning that this is Americans, or this is anybody, any state in the world that has been behind this stuff that people are seeing in the air, it would be just as breathtaking a disclosure as being told that there's intelligent life in the Jovian system to me. Because, like, for example, this quote right here, this was from the hearing yesterday. I think Elizondo said this. Documents have been submitted to Congress that show beyond a shadow of a doubt that we've been dealing with this issue since the early 1950s. I'm talking about objects that still to this day can operate beyond any type of performance characteristics of our modern aircraft. These aircraft were captured on radar in the 50s, doing 10,000, 13,000 miles an hour, and are able to execute an immediate right angle turn, do 180 degrees, pop in and out of our atmosphere, and even underwater, which we were talking about that too. And he says, where were we in the 1950s? We had barely broken the sound barrier. So, I mean, this in itself, even if there was no extraterrestrial intelligence that was involved in the creation or the reverse engineering of this technology, it's just as dumbfounding. So, I mean,
yeah, the problem is that there's a few different prevailing theories floating around out there right now. One of the theories is what I mentioned, that the whole thing is just a psyop, the entire thing, that every effort there is no good faith effort from anybody in government. The whole thing's a psyop. That's one opinion that's floating around out there. The other opinion is the technology's real, the craft are real, but it's all ours. And it's based on breakthroughs in physics that are known, that are published, and the public has simply not been aware. Well, I've got a problem with both of those narratives. I think I've expressed my problem with the first narrative, the PSYOP narrative. It's completely incoherent when you add all of the data up. But the second narrative, that we have this technology because we've developed it, and we're using the aliens sort of as a distraction because we don't want people to know that we have this advanced tech. The problem is that if it's based on science that's known and publicized, why in the world would the Department of Defense allow that material to be in the public sphere? We certainly wouldn't want China going in and making the same advances in physics. We wouldn't want them to be creating the same kind of technology. We must maintain our technological advantage at all costs. And I think that's a very good idea for the United States of America to do that, as long as it's in the right hands. So neither of those narratives are very coherent to me. The one that makes the most sense, and I know that my colleagues in ufology, the ones I respect the most, all agree with this assessment. And even if they don't vocalize it, they all agree with this assessment. The most coherent narrative is that back sometime around the 1940s, we were given or stumbled upon or recovered technology. And we have been working to reverse engineer that technology, and we have done so with varying degrees of success. We have had limited success in back engineering some of the alien technology. And as a result, we have been able to manufacture our own advanced aerospace vehicles that incorporate some of the capabilities of the alien craft. And that now there are quite a few American-made, let's say, again, in collaboration with the aerospace companies, advanced aerospace vehicles that are being confused with UFOs. So you have both things going on at the same time. You have our craft and you have their craft. But clearly, and again, evidenced in this, in Admiral Gallaudet's testimony, the Pentagon wants us to believe that it's all ours. And furthermore, there was an effort by Aero last year, either at the beginning of this year, I think it was the end of last year, they did a briefing with Congress, and they attempted to dissuade the congressmen from further inquiry into UAP, especially as it pertains to crash retrievals and alien bodies. Why? Because what they did was they presented a series of cases that were slam dunks for them, easily debunked. And among these cases was the so-called jellyfish UFO, which is a cluster of balloons. Okay, it's a cluster of balloons. I know that for a fact. It's a cluster of balloons, and so they presented Congress with these layups, these easily falsifiable accounts and sightings of UFOs. And they proceeded to dismantle them one after another, and again, trying to quell interest in the topic in Congress. There's the fingerprint of the Pentagon right there, okay? And then you have, in the midst of all of this, which is very confusing and chaotic, you also have bad actors in the UFO community. And I'm ranting a little bit here, Frank, but you have bad actors in the UFO community who are injecting all kinds of nonsense. And there's also a lot of, how can I define this? Grandstanding and showboating going on behind the scenes among certain personalities in the UFO community. And it's all about who can get their face on TV the most, and who's going to be invited to sit there in that room during these hearings. And so it's a mess. And I even saw, and I think it's real, somebody in Congress, and I don't know if it's Nancy Mace's office or somebody in Congress, is already selling merch, like disclosure merch. So it's kind of turning into a circus. And I don't know how I got off on that tangent, but
I can see there's a lot involved. That's, I think, why most people at this point are just, they probably think the whole thing is FUBAR, and until I see a damn alien for myself, I'm just going to get on with my life. And I want to ask you this before we get into one of the really the thing that interested me the most about yesterday, and that, of course, was the psychological aspect and the psychological experiences of almost like consciousness linking experiences that observers have with the craft. Is that if I were to go back even to like 2019, 20, whenever that Israeli space security chief came out and said that Donald Trump knows about the Galactic Federation and that there's going to be disclosure and all that, whether it's that or whether it's Stephen Greer or anybody else who talks about this to that level about contact and what's going to have to happen for that to make itself, solidify. I've told you, I think, and others, I have a hard time accepting the whole, well, the humans aren't ready yet line, because this implies that extraterrestrials, regardless of their origin, if it's interdimensional, if they're from heaven, if hell, whatever the hell we're talking about here, non-human entities are waiting for us to be ready, yet at the same time, the ETs are only communicating with the very organizations that are actively holding the world back from making progress. So right. That's the whole thing where the logic is broken for me. It's made me even resigned to the belief that as far as UFOs go, we're probably just talking at least largely about hidden technology. That's just where I've been, because I can't process the reasons why they wouldn't just circumvent earthly governments anymore.
The problem is for the government. The problem is that the phenomenon is accelerating. It is it is becoming more and more evident to everyday people that that the UFO phenomenon is real, because more and more people are capturing video of these craft all over the world. And it's sort of, because we're living in an age of AI, it's not like 15 years ago where somebody posts an incredible video online of a saucer or something that was captured in Mexico in the sky, and everybody sort of stops and analyzes the video. It's not like that anymore. Now videos get posted left and right, and nobody really cares anymore because it's just too difficult to differentiate between AI at this point, which is a real problem, and I get it. I do the same thing. You just don't have the time and effort to try and track down a video to see if it's AI, and it's going to be near impossible to do that in the future anyway. But the truth is that the phenomenon is burgeoning. And there's just way too many incidents happening now involving our Air Force and our Navy and other elements of the United States government. They can't keep a lid on it. They simply can't keep a lid on it. We live in an information age. They cannot, they're not in the business, not like they used to be, of just whacking people who are saying too much or leaking stuff. So the only thing, and I always say this, the government cannot control the phenomenon. They can only control the narrative. So what we're seeing is a scramble to control the narrative. And so obviously, you have to admit certain things in order to get control of the narrative. You have to admit that the phenomenon is real. You have to admit that certain footage is real, like the Go Fast gimbal and the TikTok and the Nimitz. And, because the public just isn't going to take you seriously if you don't, so you have to control the narrative. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a campaign to control the narrative. But what kind of frustrates me here is there's a lot of people who are new to the topic, who are coming at it just from a pop culture background. They've watched E.T., they've watched the various movies on UFOs, and they're familiar at a pop culture level of the topic, like a Joe Rogan level of the topic. And they're coming to the table, and they're looking at what's unfolded just in the last decade, let's say, and they're making assessments based on that information. And what frustrates me is that the best ufology, the best data, I would even say the best evidence, was not collected in the last decade, but in decades preceding this decade, in the last decade. There is voluminous data from excellent UFO researchers, ufologists, that is, in my estimation, conclusive. We know certain things about this phenomenon based on the research from the past. We know certain things. There's a lot that we don't know, but we definitely know certain things about this phenomenon. And we know both from the crash retrieval reports from guys like Leonard Stringfield, who was writing back in this, publishing his reports back in the 70s and 80s. We know things about this phenomenon through the abduction research from the excellent researchers like Turner and Jacobs and the others. And what we can say definitively, and I say we, those who have been studying all of this research going back to the 40s, we can say definitively, and every ufologist that I know that I trust and that I think is highly competent can say definitively, based on the research, that yes, there are aliens. Full stop. There are non-human biological entities involved in this phenomenon. Full stop. That question has already been answered. And it's frustrating to see people revisiting that question as if all of that data doesn't exist. And people say, well, let me see the bodies. Well, you believe in electrons and you've never seen them. I mean, there's a lot of things that people believe in every day based on anecdotal evidence, and that at some point it just becomes obvious and common sense. And the same can be said for the existence of these non-human, quote-unquote, biologicals if you are conversant with the data going back decades. But again, the problem is so many people are only familiar with pop culture and with what's been happening recently, and that's why it's so frustrating for those of us who've been in the field for a while, we already know. We know that the bodies exist. We know the beings are real. Now, who they're working for, what exactly they are they extraterrestrial? Are they interdimensional? Whatever. Those questions aren't known by the public. Somebody knows them. Somebody has answers to all those questions, working in the aerospace defense contractors for sure. But, we know the bodies are there. We know.
And here's that's a good. You're talking about decades worth of research, and I guess this is something that we all just wherever you are, that's where your consciousness is really your attention is really focused. But what about disclosure? What about these investigations outside of the United States? I think that the story for so many of us is just so largely dependent on the action of the United States government. That makes it suspect as well. How can we possibly be in the center of the universe? So I guess my question would be, with so many nations out there representing so many different kinds of cultures, and not everybody is going to the Bilderberg meetings, and not everybody is part of the same clubs, have aliens just avoided making contact with politicians in Portugal or Luxembourg or what?
No,
what?
But in many cases, and this actually came out in the last hearing, the United States government has dominated this domain. We have dominated. And in the nations that are friendly with us, we have gone and got and recovered the craft ourselves overseas, or have deals in place with these other nations that they turn that stuff over to us. We dominate this domain. We did. I think China's a big player now. But it's not. This is not just obviously a phenomenon that's constrained within the borders of the United States. It happens all over the place. I mean, in Peru, in Mexico, there's many countries who the governments have basically admitted that UFOs are real. They're in some cases they'll say extraterrestrial or alien, and they have been working closely for decades, or perhaps not so closely, but it's really out of their control. I mean, if you have a craft that crashes in the mountains of Peru, the reality is the United States, elements of the United States military are going to know that before the Peruvian government. We are just so much more advanced than they are. These other nations, they don't have satellites in space. Russia does, and they've recovered craft. China does, and they've recovered craft. So it's only the nations that have the technology deployed, that know how to look for the craft and can deploy the assets to go and recover the craft when they crash. And these craft aren't crashing every other day or every other week. You have craft that crash every now and again. There's probably years in between these events. And everyone always says, how can these aliens come from star systems, millions of light years away to the Earth in these advanced aerospace vehicles and then crash on Earth? Well, that's a very simplistic question. There's a dozen answers to that question, and here's one of the most compelling ones. They get in dogfights. They get in sorties. They shoot each other down. That's one of the very plausible explanations, and I think that is in fact what's happened in some of these cases. And then there's other cases in which you can have a very high-tech system that encounters something it had not anticipated in our atmosphere or being deployed by human beings, which would have caused a malfunction. That's another scenario which not only is plausible, I think has happened in some of these cases. And these factions, these non-human entities, have made adjustments so that doesn't happen again. Because yes, it is much more infrequent than it used to be. So adjustments have been made.
Yeah. I've heard like first generation scalar weapons that in part the Roswell crash was because of scalar weapons that had brought down craft, again, atmospheric things that could not be anticipated. But when it comes to and here's one thing I would love to hear from you about, because I have to imagine that even on a missing 411 level, this has to be part of at least playing a big part in what has become the abduction phenomenon over the years. Take a listen to this. I'm sure you've heard it. And here is a specific statement made about the interactions with these craft just upon observation, ground level observation, shared awareness stuff, psychological stuff. Take a listen to this, everybody.
Mr. Schellenberger, in this report, it's striking to me that regarding the descriptions of experiences with these various craft, several of them include biological effects and several do not. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Okay, so spheres and orbs, triangular craft, and irregular or organic craft include some descriptions of biological effects, including feelings of unease, electronic device malfunctions, long-term psychological effects such as anxiety or insomnia have been noted, feeling of being watched, a shared awareness with the triangle craft, and under the irregular and organic craft, biological effects include physical sensations of warmth or cold and unexplained smells and psychological distress. So these are very specific descriptions of the reactions of human beings, which allegedly have been noted from a study here.
So if I take this and you think about, well, okay, well, if anybody is taken out of their comfort zone and you come face to face with something you've never seen in your life and you know that you're staring at something special, I can imagine all types of anxious feelings, dread, elation, whatever. A lot of that can just be biochemical response of a stimulant that is frightening and awe-inspiring. But the shared awareness thing, I mean, I've had friends who have seen the biological, the organic craft, the kind of the almost like undulating orbs that are just hanging over the sky in Long Island Sound. And so I have a wide open mind to the truth of the matter, what they may be. But the psychological effects right there, that's pretty incredible. That's when we start opening up a door to so many other things, including what people like David Paulides has done with the Missing 411 series, and how that has tripped over and started to bleed into UFO phenomenon territory. So there's a lot here. What can you bring to us on that level, the psychological edge?
Are we talking about people who are observing UFOs just like regular people? Or are we talking about people in pilots and fighter jets who are getting in proximity to UFOs?
You know what? I think he's just talking about people who are just observing, even from ground level. But then there is also, I mean, anything you got on the pilot level too, that'd be great.
Well, we know that there were reported medical incidences with pilots who got too close to the craft, to these advanced aerospace vehicles. They experienced all kinds of psychological and physical, let's say, consequences. One of those effects was time dilation, in which time moves it differently than when you're in proximity to the craft than when you're not. That's one of the very interesting things that was reported, and this all came out in the last hearing. But there's been all kinds of medical issues, neurological. I think we probably can say with a great deal of certainty that pilots have been killed trying to intercept these craft. So, I mean, there's certainly neurological and psychological effects when you encounter the craft at close proximity. Now, for those who are witnessing UFOs or in the proximity of UFOs outside of the context of being in an aircraft, one thing you have to understand about this phenomenon, and I'm going to speak specifically to the non-human aspect of this phenomenon, the alien aspect, is that you're dealing with a highly, how can I say this? And I'm going to use the word telepathic, but that it's more than that, but a highly telepathic experience, an experience that engages you psychologically, and an experience that actually a presence, let's say, that has the power to alter your own perception of reality. That's clear. That's part of this phenomenon, especially as it pertains to the abduction, alien abduction. These entities have either, biologically speaking or technologically speaking, or both, the capability to alter human perception. And I think this explains, and we've probably talked about this before, I think this explains some of the strange phenomena that we see at Skinwalker Ranch and other such places around the world. We are engaging with an agency that is far superior to us technologically and can manipulate us psychologically. Both of those things are true. And on the other side of the equation, we know now that the government also has tools to manipulate the human psyche. You have the I believe it's called the voice of God technology, where they can transmit an audible voice into your head. So we're approaching some of these capabilities as well, but not to the extent that what I'm going to designate as the aliens have. I mean, they have the ability to generate full-blown virtual reality scenarios. This is what the late Carla Turner described them. VRSs, in which you can have an individual who's interacting with the phenomenon, who is literally seeing and hearing things that they could be in a crowd of people, and they are seeing, hearing, and experiencing something that no one else is. And it's not because they're crazy in this case. It's because they are engaging, or rather being engaged by this phenomenon. And that's true. That's absolutely true.
Well, I there's one more question I want to ask you on this, just from a technological standpoint, and anything else that you can fill in. And then I want to ask you a big question about Mars. And this is the thing that came up is transmedium travel. That pops up a lot in this talk, and it's been popping up in other hearings as well. That is especially from air to sea, as if there is no change in atmosphere. It has a lot to do with the Pais effect. We've been talking about that, the displacement of just the area around an object that allows it to just go as if there is no water resistance, there is no wind resistance, there's no G forces. You can take the 90-degree turn there. So when it comes to transmedium travel, of course, the first thing and the only thing that I start thinking about is, again, what the hell is going on under the surface of our oceans? And I swear, you and I don't think we've ever really specifically spoken about the oceans, but they freak me out more than the idea of deep space does. Where have you gone with your research specifically in what may be lying beneath?
Well, there's certainly a distinct association between UFO activity and large bodies of water. UFOs are often seen. Now, some researchers have said 50% of the cases. Others say, no, that's not quite true. But let's just say this. A lot of cases, a lot of UFO sightings and encounters happen around large bodies of water. I suspect that there's a very simple answer to this, and that in that the craft are coming out of and going into underwater bases, undersea bases. And if you're going to hide, if you really want to hide, the best place to hide isn't just under the ground, it's under the ground, under the ocean. Because there's not a whole lot of human presence in the deep sea, almost none. And if you really want to be covert, you go not only under the sea, but you build installations under the ground, under the sea floor, and you can be completely hidden and inaccessible. And I think that's exactly where a lot of these alien bases are. Now, there's a topic I'd like to inject into this conversation, just so people know that I too am open to a lot of different possibilities. I think we need to also be considering a cryptoterrestrial hypothesis when thinking about some of this phenomena. And a cryptoterrestrial is a sentient being who is cryptically or covertly inhabiting planet Earth with us, not necessarily coming from elsewhere in the cosmos, but either a species that is organic to planet Earth that has been developing along with us, or a species that came here and established bases here and a presence and a habitation here a long time ago or in the last 200 years. Those are both very plausible scenarios in my mind. And there are some indications, and there's not a whole lot that can be said about this, but there are some indications that if you think about the biological characteristics of gray aliens, for example, there is some indication that this may be an aquatic species, not necessarily like a whale or some kind of a fish that lives in water, but a species that has adapted to an aquatic environment. And just like we are adapted to an environment that is terrestrial, they would perhaps have adapted to an environment that is aquatic. In other words, maybe their natural environment is under the water. And so that makes sense for them to have bases there. And in regard to the technology, I'm going to make a bold assertion here. And I'm not necessarily married to this declaration that I'm about to make, but that I think it needs to be considered. I don't believe that any of the currently publicized science, that any of the known physics, whether it be from Hal Puthoff or any of these guys, is 100% accurate in regard to the technology that's being deployed. I think that the information, the actual science, the physics behind this technology is completely and utterly unknown to the public. And I think that I subscribe much more, let's say, to Bob Lazar's testimony, where he says that what they're doing is amplifying gravity waves, and that the amplification of gravity waves, when you manipulate gravity, you're also manipulating the fabric of space-time. So essentially, if you can do that, you don't have to move through a medium. You move the medium around you. That's what you do. And if you can move the medium around you, then it doesn't really matter. Maybe it does matter to some extent, but as it pertains to the air and water, the distance of the molecules doesn't really matter if you are moving space-time around your craft rather than moving through the medium of the air or the medium of the water.
Yeah. That's that Pais, and I think that Salvatore Pais. Did you ever speak to him? Did you ever conduct an interview with Salvatore Pais?
No, I'm aware of him. I've never spoken to him.
Okay, I would love to see you guys talk, because that is that would be it really cuts to the core of what you're talking about there. Just the displacement of the area around the object that creates the propulsion.
And I am by no means in command of the physics here. I'm not a physicist. In fact, I really suck at math, so I would make a really bad physicist. But I do understand one thing. I understand that if this is the technology that we're using or that they're using, that's been published openly, publicly, then China is developing the same stuff. And I don't believe that that is the case. I don't believe that the United States military, that the United States government would allow the science to be publicized that would result in this advanced technology. That would seem to be would be very stupid, I think, if your interest is national security and technological superiority.
Yes, it would. But then again, you know what? We are just about to embark on 4 years of possibility, and let's hope that we continue on with this, and it becomes a little bit more of a fertile ground for disclosure on all subjects. But,
and now, having said that, let me add an addendum.
Yeah,
I do believe that some of that technology, some of that theoretical physics that's being proposed by these guys, that you can derive technology from it. Some of it is probably true, but the mere fact that it's public, available, can be translated into Mandarin tells me that it's not exactly right, and you cannot derive functional technology from it. And I just want that. I just wanted to put that out there. Now, again, I'm not married to that idea, but it seems logical to me that that would be the case.
Okay. Well, as far as ancient technology, high intelligence, and even the biblical narrative, I want to switch gears just for a little bit. Keep it spacey. Sure. And all that stuff, but I want to get you on the record with this next thing, because I dug up an old thread from 2019 that I may read in the second half on Mars, and it made me think, because you were the first one to come on this show to talk specifically about the biblical account of the war in heaven being an actual kinetic battle, one that that didn't play out in an ethereal plane, but right here with heavenly craft technology that resembled war as we know it. Well, I dug up, like I said, this old thread about Mars, and what I wanted to know what you think about the theory of Mars being ruined by an ancient nuclear war, and that its demise has a lot to do with our our place over here in Earth. Is it a? Let's just start with that. What do you think about that theory?
Oh, I would be sympathetic to the idea that there was an how can I put this? Let me put it in these terms. I'm sympathetic to both the idea that there was an artificially produced catastrophe, like maybe something nuclear, maybe not nuclear, maybe something much more advanced than that. For example, antimatter, antimatter explosion is way more powerful than nuclear. So I would probably lean towards antimatter, but I know that some people say that there's evidence of specifically a nuclear explosion on Mars. I've not looked into that. I'm aware of the theory. I've not looked into the data myself, but again, I'm sympathetic to the idea of an artificially induced catastrophe that was brought on by the detonation of some kind of destructive technology, and even more sympathetic to the notion that Mars experienced an unimaginable, how do I want to say this? That it experienced, let's say, a devastating cataclysm. And I think that cataclysm was the result, personally, of the explosion of a planet or planetoid that once existed between Mars and Jupiter. And maybe both of those things are true. In fact, I would be sympathetic to both of them being true at the same time, that there was some kind of an artificial catastrophe, and at the same time, Mars has been subjected to an unimaginably destructive cataclysm, perhaps resulting from the explosion of a planetoid that is now the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter.
Well, that's an interesting concept. The asteroid belt is the remains of an old planet. Yeah, I remember the thread, and when I had brought it up here, I remember it had a lot to do with the presence of xenon, and how it's risen in our atmosphere over here since we started testing nuclear bombs, and it had something to do with the Viking probe and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. So and then it always comes back to people with Cydonia, the face, the pyramids out there. Nobody believes that there's a good amount of people who believe that it's impossible for those things to naturally just crop up like that.
Well, there's something interesting to be said of that. Back about a decade ago, that was a big deal. You had Richard Hoagland going around talking about the face on Mars. And there's not only allegedly is there a face, but there's also a pentagonal pyramidal structure there in the same vicinity in the region of Cydonia. There it is. And also, you also have what could be construed as a metropolitan complex there as well, like a city. And what happened was the Viking probe came back with these images, and they were low resolution images, and people entertained these ideas. And then they sent up another, I can't remember what it was called. There was another observer that was orbiting Mars, and it was able to capture higher resolution images and ostensibly debunked the face on Mars, the pentagonal pyramidal structure, and so forth. And there's two things we need to consider here. First and foremost, NASA is in the business of airbrushing. They really like Photoshop a lot. That's the first thing you have to consider. The second thing you have to consider is if the Cydonia region of Mars was subjected to a exceedingly destructive force, like a cataclysm resulting from the explosion of that planetoid or planet that we mentioned, then we would likely see, especially in that case, we would likely see the vaporization, first of all, of most of that planet. Most people don't realize that. Most of the planet would be vaporized. But we would also see an intense heat that would be radiating on Mars, such that it would have the potential to melt the mountains like wax, just as the Bible describes, by the way. And the Bible uses that term, and I don't have the address here in front of me, but it uses that term in reference to the earth witnessing, the earth itself being a witness to a cataclysmic force that could melt the mountains like wax. So if the Cydonia region of Mars was subjected to that kind of destruction, that kind of heat, then it's possible that face on Mars and that the potential face on Mars, the potential pentagonal pyramid, were partially melted, are not obviously not in a pristine condition, and not just in a ruined condition, but actually were melted partially. And I think that that's something that needs to be considered when looking even at the newer images of Mars in these regions, because it does appear to me that pentagonal pyramid, that structure especially is very interesting to me. And if you imagine it having been exposed to very high degrees of heat, you can imagine it losing a little bit of its shape, and it almost looks like it was melted. Now, whether or not it was, I don't know, but I think we should consider that. So consider the airbrushing and consider cataclysm having affected those structures. But basically, once those newer photos were released, most people just thought it's debunked. Yeah. There's no face on Mars. It's just a natural plateau. It may be. I'm not saying that's not true, but I don't think we should give up on it just yet. Cydonia is very interesting. That area of Mars, that region of Mars, is highly intriguing for many reasons, and I personally believe there was a civilization there.
See, okay, so then my last question on this, because this could be a topic for another night altogether, but I just wanted to put it on the record because it's been sitting here on my desktop, and I just wanted to ask, would you think, because what we're talking about here had to be ancient, could this in any way, shape, or form be a part of the same war that was being waged over here on Earth as told in the Bible?
Yes. And in fact, it's difficult. This takes a long time to unfold, so I won't attempt to do it here. But, I always say that the most consequential book I've ever read in my life is a book called Cydonia, The Secret Chronicles of Mars by the late David Flynn. This contains that book here. There's David Flynn. He died in 2012. And I've actually been going through, in my members community, I've been going through, systematically going through this book with David Flynn's twin brother, Mark Flynn. And we've been going chapter by chapter. And the narrative, there's a narrative, and of course in my book Birthright, I'm carrying the baton from David Flynn and continuing this narrative. The narrative, again, it takes a long time to unpack, but you can detect this narrative in the Hebrew Old Testament of what I describe as a cosmic or galactic war. And this war has two things that are always associated. You have something called Rahab, which I believe was a planet, and you have this entity called the dragon, who's associated with Rahab. And the dragon was pierced and Rahab was shattered like a vessel of clay. This is the kind of terminology you find in the biblical narrative. And again, we don't have time to break all of this down here. If people are interested in that, I would encourage them to go over and become a member in the Alberino, in my members community, because it's really fascinating. It's very detailed. I document it in my book Birthright, and there is no explanation. There is no, in my opinion, there is no scholarly explanation that can define who or what exactly is Rahab in the Old Testament. And there's an attempt to say, well, Rahab is the woman who let down those two spies, those two Hebrew spies out the window, and that's a whole narrative. But that's not true. It's not the same word. There is this narrative in the Hebrew Old Testament that I think is conveying to us the idea of a pre-Adamic, kinetic, cosmic war. And I think the destruction of Mars and the other planets in our solar system and the destruction of Planet Rahab ensued during this conflict. And this happened long before the creation of Adam. Again, this is a very, very, very that's why I'm struggling to try and encapsulate it here. It's a very, very complex topic. It takes a lot of time to unravel, but it's exceedingly fascinating.
Oh, it definitely is. And it's funny. I'm going to keep I have about 10 questions that were sent to me for you by a member of the audience. Her name is Carly, and she had questions that were mainly based on Flynn's work, and it's they were questions that were based on not only Flynn's work but also your work in Birthright. And without spending a night really packaging, laying out a chronological discussion on this topic, I didn't want to start getting into the weeds there. But one of the questions she asked me that we've essentially answered along in this little tiny nutshell of a segment. She said, can Timothy use the planet Mars, the state it's in right now, what the state of disrepair, all that stuff, to expand on the idea that the spiritual domains might extend beyond Earth? What transdimensional or extraterrestrial territories are contested by spiritual entities as discussed in Birthright? I guess it's very easy to see that you would say, yes, the spiritual domain does extend beyond Earth, and especially if you think that Mars met its demise, whatever civilization was there, could have been there, met its demise during the same battles that you've mapped out for us in the Bible.
Yeah, I think my only scruple with that statement would be the word spiritual. I mean, when we're talking about Mars and Cydonia and cities and pyramids and the face on Mars and kinetic war, we're in the realm of the physical here, solidly in the realm of the physical. And I believe in a spiritual component, but in the same way that I believe that we human beings are composites of spirit and flesh. And I don't think spirit means what people think it means. And I don't necessarily subscribe to a spiritual realm, like an ethereal place where there's nothing physical, or like a completely different realm altogether that's separate from the universe in which we currently inhabit. And so that would be my only thought, preliminary thought. But yes, otherwise I agree that again, as I stated earlier, I believe that certainly Mars, perhaps other planets in our solar system, including the Earth, were inhabited in a pre-Adamic context, and I believe that the biblical narrative, that there are intimations of this reality and the conflict that brought them to ruin in the biblical narrative. And again, we're going through all of this in my members community, and anyone who's interested in a deep dive can go over there and you'll see that content. And I certainly would be willing to come back on your show and unpack this in a much better way. Again, it takes quite a long time. You have to reference the relevant passages in the Bible, and there's a lot to discuss.
Okay. No, I'd be down with that, especially once the holidays are over. I'd love to get into the weeds on something like that in the winter, and that would be really, really great. So we're gonna put that one on ice, and I'm glad that I brought it up. Then so okay, well then, Timothy,
It's a fascinating conversation. It really, really is.
Yeah, it is. I'd love to, because especially when you look up into the sky at night and you can see. Whenever certain planets come into view and you catch a glimpse of Mars, or Jupiter has been over the horizon a few times over the last few weeks, and it's just for those specks, specks on the horizon. It's just crazy to think of that being another battlefront in what is a solar system wide, I don't know, conflict at some point. Anyway, there's so many questions to be formulated on that end. Tell everybody where you're going to be next, how they can follow your work. I know you're very active on Twitter, but I have your URL in the description.
You can find me on social media. My handle is always the same. I'm the only Timothy Alberino. My YouTube channel, Timothy Alberino, Instagram, X. And if you're interested in joining my members community, you can go to the alberinoanalysis.com, thealberinoanalysis.com. and join us in those conversations over there. Thanks, Frank, for having me back on. I always like talking to you. You always have very interesting questions.
I always like asking them because I can just sit back and enjoy the answers. So all the best to you and your family, and we'll talk soon. I would definitely love to have you on for some Christmas-related topic, as we usually do. So we'll be in touch, and all the best from all of us over here to all of you over there.
Likewise, my friend.
All right, take care. There goes Timothy.